Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others, Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
In the name of the one who took up his cross, died, and rose again. Amen. So in an alternate universe, back when the pandemic was easing up and we didn't know yet about the dangers of the Delta variant, we planned for this Sunday to be Welcome Sunday. The Sunday when our program year began, our formation classes for all ages began, we were going to have a picnic. I don't mention this to make you feel bad, for we all know in this new normal that we have to be realistic about the situation, that we have to grieve the things that we lose, and we need to be thankful for what is possible. I remind you of this because I want you to enter into an alternative universe, that alternative universe with me, and imagine that this morning is Welcome Sunday. And one of us, probably me, decided that we should have a banner that flew outside the church to welcome people back and to encourage people and to inspire them to be faithful. And I had the great idea that the banner should be based on the gospel lesson appointed for this Sunday. And so the banner read, "Welcome to St. Philip's, where you are invited to pick up your cross and lose your life." It is times like this and gospel lessons like this one that we realize that Jesus did not come into the world to pack the pews, or to attract people to church with pithy, uplifting statements. No. Jesus came to save us and to show us the way to meaning and purpose and fulfillment and redemption. Jesus came to show us that the way of life is the way of the cross and resurrection. So I don't think our gospel lesson this morning works well for a banner, but I know that it works very well to discover a life well lived, a life worth living. Our gospel lesson this morning from Mark's gospel is a hinge moment in the story of Jesus. It's actually a hinge moment in all of the synoptic gospels. This is the moment when Jesus' ministry turns from what it had been of healing and teaching and gathering together a community to turning towards Jerusalem and turning towards the cross. In fact, in Luke's gospel, it says at this moment, Jesus turned his face toward Jerusalem. It's time to make that journey toward Jerusalem, towards the cross, towards resurrection. Up until this point, the followers of Jesus have seen him perform miracles and teach about God's presence and power in their lives. And now Jesus is checking in with them. Who do people say that I am? What have they noticed in my ministry? What do you think they think God is up to in my ministry? Well, some say John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others say one of the prophets. But Jesus turns to the disciples and asks them, but who do you say that I am? And Peter, always Peter, but this time he gets it right, says, you are the Messiah. In Mark's gospel, it's a little different than the other gospels. Jesus tells them to tell no one. Keep this a secret. And then Jesus goes on to redefine for the disciples what a Messiah is. Remember that the people of Jesus' time lived under occupation from Roman authorities, and they longed for the restoration of their power. They longed for the restoration of their kingdom that they had heard the tales of, that had been so powerful under King David. Remember, just a few Sundays ago, we talked about this Davidic covenant, the covenant that God made with David when God said, your line will reign forever. And so when they talked about the Messiah, the disciples were thinking about that person who would come with military might and be able, as David did, to unite the kingdoms and form a powerful kingdom. But Jesus says no. The Messiah must go to Jerusalem, where he will suffer and die, and after 3 days rise again. We know this story well, so it's hard for us to remember how shocking that must have been for the disciples, to hear that Jesus wasn't the kind of Messiah that they were longing for. So Peter takes Jesus aside and says, Jesus, you're playing this all wrong. Don't tell him that you're going to die. Don't tell them that you have to suffer. But Jesus responds rather harshly. Don't tell me how to be the Messiah. Get behind me, Satan. Your kind of old thinking is going to get in the way of this new thing that God is doing. And then Jesus shares further shocking news. Not only is Jesus going to suffer and die, but those who want to follow him must also lose their life in order to find their life. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world but forfeit his life? It's at that moment, I think, that the disciples must have started to realize, even if they couldn't admit it to themselves quite yet, that this was not simply an effort to gain as many followers as possible and to build up their political power and their military power. And we realize that this is not a strategy for church growth. This is a message for urgent times. A message that calls us, even in the most difficult moments of our lives, to respond with courage and faithfulness and love. To respond with a willingness to put our own lives on the line for the good of the world. Yesterday, we marked the 20th anniversary of just such a time as that. It was a very scary day, ushering in a very difficult couple of decades, and I think we are still recovering from that day. But as I reflected on it, I reflected on how it was also, for me, a call to pick up my cross and follow Christ. I bet everybody here remembers what they were doing on that morning. Maybe not Emily, who wasn't born yet, but the rest of us all can remember what we were doing on the morning of September 11th, who we were with, what our immediate thoughts were. I was working as the refugee ministry coordinator at All Saints Episcopal Church in downtown Atlanta. This is a large parish in Midtown, and on September 11th, we had an all-day parish planning meeting where the entire staff, it was a large staff, would spend the whole day together looking at the calendar and planning the events of the church year. And so we were all together, the entire staff, in a room. It was actually even in the upper room of the building. I wasn't ordained yet. I was a lay person working for the Episcopal Church. But we had 4 priests on staff, so there were priests in the room. And one of the priests was running late, and so she came in after we had started the staff meeting and told us what was happening. And I remember my own feeling of numbness as she described it, that as I always do when I hear shocking news, I sort of went inside. I felt unable to process it. I just felt numb and disassociated. And then I remember that our rector thought that we should just keep going on with our meeting. He was the kind of guy who said it's a time of national crisis, the church needs to be the church and to do the work of the church, and that means planning what we're going to be doing with this program year. The other priest, another priest in the room, was furious about that. And he started yelling at him. How can you want us to continue the meeting? He really lost it. And then a third priest said, well, maybe we should stop and pray. It was at that moment that I realized that Episcopal priests, forgive me, any Episcopal priests, I see you back there, Ian, in the room, are pieces of work. And I thought, oh, maybe this is the group I belong to. I think we did try to go on with the meeting, but then eventually somebody brought a TV in, and we just started watching the news together. Some of the parents of young children excused themselves to go check on their kids. A couple other things I remember about that day. It was our all-day parish staff meeting, so we had the plan to get our picture taken as a staff on the front stairs of the church. And so our photographer showed up, so they thought, well, let's go ahead and get the picture taken. So we all went out onto the steps of the church, and the church faced the skyscraper for what was then Nations Bank, is now Bank of America, the really tall building. And somebody had called in a bomb threat to the Bank of America building, and so people were just, as we were standing there getting our picture taken, people were just streaming out of the building. I mean, it was very bizarre. Not surprisingly, when that picture came back, we decided we needed to do that again. Everybody's faces were just stunned. The other thing I remember about that day, and again, a sense of calling, was that we gathered in the church in the afternoon to pray together the Great Litany. I was new to the Episcopal Church, new to the Book of Common Prayer, and that prayer, that beautiful language of that prayer, held me so effectively, held us so effectively. It speaks about every aspect of life and offers it all to God. And it was just very meaningful to me. What I mostly remember about that time, and remember I was working with refugees at the time. We had refugees, we were helping to resettle refugees from all over the world. We had a family from Afghanistan, this was pre-invasion. It was a mother and her children. They'd lost the father, and they were fleeing the Taliban, and we were helping resettle them in Atlanta. We also had that group called the Lost Boys. I don't know if you remember this group that came in the year 2000. These young men from Sudan who had been separated from their families and had spent their teen years living in refugee camps, and we were helping to resettle them. I remembered how unsettling and frightening it was for this community of refugees. They had fled their countries to find safety, and then to have this dramatic showing that violence can visit them even here. Marie Louise was a refugee from Rwanda. She had survived the genocide in Rwanda, and All Saints, the church where I was working, had hired her as a receptionist. So I remember she was standing there with me when we were getting our picture taken, and I asked her, "How are you doing, Marie Louise?" And she said, "I'm very frightened." And she reminded me that the conflict in her home country had started with an airplane crash, and then it had devolved from there to the point where she and her family had to escape the country. A few days later, a couple of the Lost Boys were walking to a bus stop, and they were accosted from their apartment to a bus stop, and they were accosted by some people who told them they didn't belong in this country and they should go home. And I remember them calling me, and they were so, even though they'd lived through such extraordinary stuff, they were still maintain this sense of being naive, and they just couldn't understand why someone would say that to them. We're in the United States. This is where everybody's so friendly. During those weeks when it was so scary, remember the anthrax letters, and nobody really knew where they came from, and postal workers died. That ministry of being present with these new friends from all over the world, of reminding my refugee friends that they belonged and that they were loved, it gave me such a strong sense of meaning. It really helped me to heal, to be present with them, to remind them of God's love. I gained so much from them. In late September, we had a picnic with our refugee ministry and volunteers from All Saints, and many of the families came, and some community volunteers came, and I wrote an article about it for the church newsletter. So this past week I dug it up, and the real miracle is, after 7 moves since that day, I found it. So I want to read a little bit of it to you, mostly because it sort of like our pictures, our school pictures, it reminds me of my younger self when I was just feeling those beginning feelings of vocational call, and I was so idealistic and truly believed that God was, I still believe, but that naive, that beginning sense of God's work in my life. So here it is from November 2001. Refugee Ministry Picnic, celebrating our connections. The sky was blue, and the air was filled with the first hints of autumn crispness, a perfect day for a picnic. Refugee friends from 11 different countries, All Saints volunteers, and friends from the community gathered to celebrate life and the wonderful surprise that we are deeply connected to one another. Considering the events of September 11th, the picnic took on a more pertinent function. I love that, pertinent function. It was a welcome relief from the tension that many, especially within the refugee community, were feeling. How frightening it must feel to have lived through war, escaped to safety in the United States, and then to find that violence visits us here. Many of the refugees have already lived through the persecution of minority groups that often follows national crisis. Some have even survived genocide. We are glad you are here, we Americans were able to say to our beloved friends. As we rediscover our allegiance to our country, let us not forget our allegiance to all of humanity, to the entire household of God. Let us not forget that this country's plurality makes us beautiful, creative, and strong. Over the last 18 months or so, we have been living in another time when Jesus' invitation to pick up your cross and follow resonates deeply. We need to hear that call, that invitation in our life. We need that meaning that comes from following Jesus. And I think there are many people in our world who need to hear that message too, who are longing to hear that the path to a life worth living is a path through cross and resurrection. Losing your life does not need to be dramatic. It is in the daily actions of love, of reaching out to those who are lost or lonely or struggling and letting them know that they belong, that God loves them, and that they have a place in our community. There were no easy responses to 9/11, and we're still living many of those responses 20 years later. And there are no easy solutions to the troubles that we have today. Our leaders are a little bit like those priests in my staff meeting on 9/11. Just trying to figure out the best, most faithful way to respond. We all have different ways of dealing and different ideas on how to proceed. But what holds us together is our faith. Like that great litany, our relationship to the Messiah who didn't follow the old way of doing things, of restoring dignity through conflict and war, but instead showed us a new way, a way of being a living sacrifice, losing one's life to find it. So I think after all, it is Welcome Sunday. Welcome. This is not an easy life, this following Jesus, this being a disciple of Jesus, but it is a life filled with relationship, with connection, with purpose and meaning. It is a life filled with love. Thanks be to God.